Good afternoon or evening, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and today I'm doing a little bit of a different type of video. I want to talk a little bit about some misconceptions I think a lot of people have regarding American politics, as well as the Electoral College and how our presidential elections work here in the States, because I do have some foreign viewers, but also it's good to make sure that Americans understand our system because we actually have to vote in our system. Just as a little bit of an aside, from now on my videos are going to probably come a little bit later in the day. Won't really get into why, but long story yeah. Anyway, as always, if you like the content, likes, comments, subscriptions, they really do help, and I greatly appreciate all the support I've been getting in the first half of the year. I think this is the fastest my channel has ever grown this first half of the year, so I want to thank everybody very genuinely for that. It is greatly appreciated, and it is a little humbling, if I'm honest, that 400 some odd people have found my content good enough to subscribe. So, yeah. Anyway, let's actually get on to these misconceptions and kind of explain some things. So, there's a surprising amount of people, even in the United States, but especially abroad, who are under the impression that there's only two parties in American politics, or every ballot you've only got two choices, the Republicans and the Democrats. No, it's not the case. Very often you'll have various independent candidates, even for gubernatorial offices, Senate elections, even House elections. You'll sometimes have 3, 4, 5, 6 candidates in the general election. That said, generally speaking, only two parties are going to be competitive. Most of the time, it's going to be the Republicans and the Democrats. Sometimes one party or the other, one of those two parties, which I'll just call the major parties. Generally speaking, those are the only two competitive parties, but occasionally one of them will sit out an election in what they would feel is a safe seat, or if they just can't recruit anybody for that seat. And occasionally a third party will get a significant amount of the vote, at least for them, in the upper teens, simply because there's no major party running in opposition to the other one. This happens very rarely for the most part. Typically, the two major parties contest every single election, every single seat, every single election. Though that is not always the case. For example, here in Old Dominion, where I live, the Commonwealth of Virginia, I'm going to highlight it right here. Very often, a few decent amount of delegate seats and state Senate seats weren't contested in 2018. And that's kind of sometimes a bad thing, but also it's sometimes just a reflection of how one-sided that seat's demographics are in favor of one party or the other. In addition, one of the reasons why third-party and independents tend to have a difficult time in American politics is because we use first-past-the-post, as well as the fact that there's no real strong regional brand of politics. And a lot of people say, well, wait, what about, the unique context and culture of, say, the South, or the West Coast, or the New England area? Sure, those areas do tend to have their own unique flavor in terms of both culture and politics, but for the most part, it's within the context of the major parties. For example, the South votes Republican despite, again, some people would call it communitarian, sort of not really left-wing economically, but certainly more open to certain types of policies. Um, but they're very socially conservative. West Virginia would be a very good example where there's a decently strong union culture and support for some level of Medicare, Medicaid, that sort of thing, as well as support for expanding it. But at the same time, they like their guns. They aren't exactly fans of the whole gay marriage thing. And that's just kind of a generalization, and that's kind of all I want to talk about with this type of thing, is the general picture. There's, of course, tons of exceptions, but West Virginia is just a very good example because in the same cycle and picture, you can have a Democrat such as Joe Manchin win with a fairly comfortable margin, despite Donald Trump winning by over 20 points in the Mountain State. So it is interesting to see that sort of thing. And that also brings me to the next one, is that not all Republicans are the stereotypical picture of what a lot of people would say a Republican is. Look at Charlie Baker, Phil Scott, or even Chris Sununu, Larry Hogan in Maryland is another good example. They tend to be fairly liberal Republicans. A lot of people say, well, there's no such thing as a liberal Republican. Really? Look, Charlie Baker certainly fits that mold. Larry Hogan, again, Phil Scott in Vermont. They're all solid examples of a liberal Republican still in existence. You go to West Virginia, you got a conservative Democrat in Joe Manchin. Though conservative Democrats are much more rare than liberal Republicans, especially when it comes to being in elected office. This is not always the case, but at least in the current picture of U.S. politics. And that just goes to show that, yeah, the parties are still relatively big tent parties, which is, harping on this picture that the parties aren't just all homogenous when it comes to political beliefs. There's very hardline conservatives, Tea Party. You've got a few libertarian Republicans such as Rand Paul. For a while, Justin Amash was another one, though he's now a registered libertarian, so... You've got a few moderate Republicans. Think of Mitt Romney, which is definitely not something you would have said in 2012, but even in 2012, he was still fairly moderate. John McCain, the late John McCain, was another example. Jeff Flake is another moderate Republican, even though he's no longer in office. But you have moderate Democrats in the form of Kyrsten Sinema, though a lot of the Trump crowd wouldn't call her moderate. Compared to other Democrats, she is very moderate. So again, Joe Manchin, I would actually argue Joe Manchin is probably the last conservative Democrat. Unless you want to talk about John Bel Edwards in Louisiana, but But that's just kind of, again, the unique nature of the South when it comes to its elected officials. But that divide is starting to kind of dry up in a lot of regards, where conservative Democrats are being kind of pushed out of their party, similar to liberal Republicans and moderate Republicans. Though the moderate Republicans are being pushed out more than the liberal ones for weird reasons, and really reasons that I'm not 100% sure how that one happened. Florida is its own world, both politically and just in general. And you really just have to be from Florida to fully understand Florida politics. Another one is another misconception or overgeneralization that I think a lot of people don't realize about the Electoral College, even though there's a lot of discussion about it, is it's not a contest to see who can win the most states. If I were to take this, clear out the map, for example, and talk about a cursed way to win the presidency, you don't need the most states or even the majority of people to vote for you in a presidential election in order to win the Electoral College. Next one would be 29, and I believe it's the 20s. I think that's all the 20s. I think the next one is Ohio. And then, let's see if I can remember, I believe it would be Michigan and Georgia, and then North Carolina, then New Jersey at 14 is the next one up. Yeah. So that is, I think 11 states. That's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 states is all you need to win in order to win the presidency. Now that is assuming, of course, this map is not exactly a very likely map, where, say, where these are the only states you win. And this is, again, because voters from a lot of places are significantly different. Texas voters and California voters are very different from each other. North Carolina voters are different than Illinois voters. New Yorkers are really different from, say, Georgia voters. And so on and so forth. But you can also win with a very small number of voters. If we just go by fewest Electoral College votes, okay, I think that's all the 3s. So we can go to the 4s now. It's Rhode Island, it's New Hampshire, that would be Maine. Are there any more 4s? There's Hawaii. And then 5s, you got Nebraska, New Mexico, West Virginia. I forgot Alaska, which is a 3. I believe now we go to 6s. I think that's it on those. There's a 7 vote. I think that's the only 7 vote. Oh, I missed Kansas. Oh, there's that. There's that. Then we go to the 8s. There's Louisiana, Kentucky. That's actually all of the 8s and 9s. That would be it there. 10s, and that's it. 11s, Tennessee, Arizona. There's one state with 12. There's a state with 13. I missed. And then New Jersey will put you over the top. But the funny thing is that you flip New Jersey, right? And if you won just the barest majority in all of these states and not a single vote, I think it winds up being like 22.6% of the popular vote nationally if you don't win a single vote in any of the largest 9 states and only win slim majorities in the rest. So, yeah, now of course this is an extremely unlikely map. But again, the point is, number one, you don't need to win the popular vote nationally. You don't even need to come close. And you don't need to win the majority of states in order to become president. And a lot of people would probably be right in questioning, why does the United States have a system like this? And the reason is because the United States is a federal republic. And all this means is we divide our government and the responsibilities of our government between a national level which is the president, vice president, Congress, and the judiciary, the federal judiciary. So Supreme Court, appellate courts, appeals courts, circuit courts, etc. The state governments, which are most of the time modeled very closely on the national government, so most of them are bicameral legislatures with an executive, but called a governor, and a state court system. And those are operated on a federal level as well, where they give some power over to the counties and municipalities. And counties can even give power to the local townships, cities, and villages within that county's borders. So there's a lot of differences between these. And this allows, say, Texas or Utah to govern based off of what's best for the citizens of those states, and the counties can even go and say, we have certain situations that we need to handle ourselves that are beneficial to our people. Now, one of the problems is with this system, and you could call it a problem, some would call it a benefit, is that there's going to be oftentimes contradictions between the national level and the state level, or the state level and the county level, and such like that. And a good example of where there are differences in policy from one level to the next would be guns. And the only reason why I'm reaching to this is because it's the easiest example to think of. Whereas, say, nationally speaking, there's no rules on whether or not you can carry concealed or not. Unless you want to interpret McDonald versus Chicago to mean that to bear arms is part of to keep and bear arms, and whether or not that's fully incorporated. The conventional wisdom is to say that it should, and every state allows some form of concealed carry. However, there's a difference between some states being what's known as shall issue, meaning you apply as long as you have clean background check and don't use illicit substances, you're good to go. And may issue, where a state could say, well, you have to demonstrate a good reason for why you need to carry. For example, a credible threat against your life, or a job that requires you to be armed, such as drivers of armored cars for banks, or anyone who handles a large amount of cash or works for a security firm. And there's a lot of difference that needs to be resolved there. Or you could say, well, it's a good thing because, say, in California, well, we don't want any crazies to have guns. Why would we want them to carry in public? You don't need to carry in public. At least that's their mindset. And I'm not going to get into the minutia of policy here. I'm just kind of discussing why we have a system like this, right? And some of the issues that can arise, whether or not they're good or bad, that's up to you. I'm not here to tell you what to think. Another good example is, nationally speaking, you can own a machine gun if you file the correct paperwork. However, a lot of states have banned NFA items, National Firearms Act items, which includes but is not limited to silencers, machine guns, short-barreled rifles, short-barrel shotguns, and destructive devices. There's a few other items that are often covered as well. But then there are other states which say you can own whatever you want. It's a free country. And again, the courts have yet to weigh in on this type of thing, but that has to do with incorporation, whether or not the Second Amendment is fully incorporated into the Constitution. And all incorporation means when it comes to an amendment for the Constitution is that it applies to the states, not just the federal government. For example, the First Amendment is fully incorporated, and there is a ton of case law on that. Other amendments are much less clear, or at least in terms of their case law supporting it. But you may say, well, that doesn't mean you shouldn't have a popular vote nationally. And I'd argue it actually does. Because you look at the situation, and in a federal republic, you need to have a reason to have separate jurisdictions. And in a nation as large, culturally diverse, ethnically and racially diverse as the United States, you're going to need different laws in different places to best suit the people who live there. And you're going to need to allow that sort of freedom for different localities to permit different things. For example, in Montana, the enforceability of speed limits there is dubious at best. I'm pretty sure they do have speed limits in some areas, but in others that they're just not enforced even if they're posted. And part of that's because Montana is a gigantic state where there's no real reason to have them because they're so unpopulated. Now, you can still get a speeding ticket in areas where there's no enforcement of speed limits, but you only really get one if you crash, and your ticket is going to be you were going too fast for conditions. But that's the thing. How does the federal government enforce a 21-year, an age 21 drinking age, a minimum of being 21 years old to drink? Well, they withhold funding for the highway system and the roads if you refuse to have your drinking age be 21. And it's a little interesting, the conflicts that happen, because supposedly the federal government has complete jurisdiction over the entire country, whereas a state can say, yeah, we're just going to do something different. And under a system where you have a direct popular vote for the national government, it lessens the power of each state and the people of that state to have their own political sway or have their own local policies. Because if one group feels comfortable enough that they can continue to maintain large majorities or just a majority in general nationally, they'll start implementing policies there and enforcing them in places that just don't want to enforce them in order to get their way in states that are uncooperative in enforcing their policies. For example, let's say the Republicans got in power nationally and they felt comfortable enough in their ability to maintain a popular vote majority, and they decided to implement very tight laws on abortions. A lot of states that lean Democratic probably wouldn't be too thrilled about that and would start issuing challenges. But if the Republicans felt comfortable enough in their popular vote majority, they could say, well, we're going to enforce this whether you like it or not. And that kind of defeats the purpose of having different states and different jurisdictions, and it defeats the whole purpose of federalism, which is to ensure that local people get as much representation as possible at the local level where it's going to affect them most. And this is an argument that defenders of both the Electoral College but also a very strict interpretation of the Constitution tend to harp on, is that you go to a direct national popular vote, and you're boosting the power of the federal government at the expense of local government. Where supporters of a direct popular vote will say is, well, we're just trying to make sure that the nation has relatively uniform laws. And there's good and bad arguments for both. Both good and bad arguments, but as well as good and bad faith arguments in both camps, saying that, oh, this is a good idea or this is a bad idea and here's why. And most of the arguments are both good and in good faith, but there are good arguments that are made in bad faith and there are bad arguments made in good faith. So the American system is very unique, and it's difficult even for Americans to understand, and even for people who study this to fully wrap their head around just the complexities of the overlapping jurisdictions, the differences in application of certain laws, the emphasis in some areas of certain types of policies, and all that stuff. And you can make an argument over what the role of the national government is versus what the role of the state governments are, or even the county or municipality governments. And this is why American politics is surprisingly difficult to understand. And because of because of the United States' significance on the world's and global stage, a lot of people who aren't from the U.S. pay attention, but they get confused by the complexity, the unwieldiness of the American system. And it is kind of unwieldy, if we're honest. But that's sort of by design, because the founders of the nation and the framers of our form of government, the Constitution, they didn't want a very strong central government. It's become stronger over the years, and there are a few people who have really made efforts to make the federal government stronger. John Adams, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt. They really boosted the power of the federal government within our federal framework. So, just as a heads up, when I say we are a federal republic, that's not me saying we're not a democracy. No, republicanism is just the political science term for representative democracy. And that's what we are. We are a representative democracy where we elect people to represent our interests in government. And in general, it works. And in general, things run smoothly. But we've also had basically nearly 250 years of undisturbed ability to smooth out the kinks in the system. So I don't think the U.S. government, or at least the exact form of the U.S. government, could have arisen at anywhere else in the world or in any other time span in the world, because it would take a very long time to smooth out any problems and any inconsistencies. I mean, we're still doing it to this day, by the way, is tweaking each individual part. Anyway, I've kind of rambled on long enough, so I'm going to say thank you all for watching. Again, if you like the content, likes, comments, subscriptions, they really do help. And have Have a very nice evening, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.